Hey there! Tonight, we're stepping into a world where lightning bolts weren't the only things Zeus hurled. This isn't a love story, it's a survival guide. We'll trace the lives of those unfortunate enough to be tied to the king of the gods. From Hera's eternal patience to the mortals who paid dearly for divine attention, their tales are woven with jealousy, deception, and the kind of drama even Olympus couldn't contain. If this kind of mythology helps you drift off, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly helps you rest. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's oddly comforting to imagine all of us scattered across the world falling asleep to the same old stories of chaos and lightning. So, get comfortable, let the world quiet down, and listen closely to what it was really like to be married to Zeus. Zeus, king of the gods, ruler of the sky, and occasional bringer of lightning-related property damage, was not exactly the image of domestic peace. He was the final child of Cronus and Rhea, and like most of his family, his early life began with an act of mild horror. Cronus, having been warned that one of his children would overthrow him, decided to swallow each one at birth. His wife Rhea, understandably exhausted by this practice, hid the newborn Zeus in a cave on Crete and handed her husband a rock wrapped in cloth instead. In that cave, tended by nymphs and fed on the milk of a divine goat named Amalthea, Zeus grew up surrounded by the sounds of sacred drums and shields. The curettes, armoured dancers, would clash their weapons to drown out the infant's cries so Cronus wouldn't hear. It was an odd childhood, but then again, Greek gods were never known for normal family dynamics. When Zeus came of age, he returned to set things right. He tricked Cronus into regurgitating his swallowed siblings, a deeply unpleasant image, and led them in a 10-year war against the Titans. When the smoke cleared, Zeus stood triumphant, his brothers Poseidon and Hades at his side. They divided the cosmos by drawing lots. Poseidon took the sea, Hades got the underworld, and Zeus claimed the sky. And, it must be said, everything else he fancied. From that moment onward, Zeus ruled Olympus with the confidence of someone who believed the universe was a personal inheritance. His throne was gilded, his beard magnificent, and his thunderbolts hand-forged by Hephaestus himself. Mortals prayed to him for rain, kings swore oaths in his name, and poets sang of his justice. But justice, in the world of Olympus, was not the tidy, law-abiding concept we like to imagine. It was divine politics. Absolute power wrapped in cloud and lightning. The ancient Greeks didn't see their gods as moral exemplars. They were reflections of the world itself. Majestic, unpredictable, and often unfair, Zeus embodied that paradox perfectly. To farmers, he was the bringer of rain and fertility. To sailors, the wind at their backs. And to those who lied under oath, he was the flash of punishment that came without warning. Yet for all his might, Zeus had one particular weakness: himself. Specifically, his inability to keep his divine attention focused for more than 5 minutes without falling in love with someone. This would become a recurring problem for everyone. In most myths, Zeus appears less like a god king and more like a mythological catastrophe in progress. He disguised himself as animals, clouds, and even showers of gold just to pursue mortals and immortals alike. One day he's an eagle carrying off Ganymede, the next he's a swan wooing Leda, for the record, Turning into a swan to impress someone is an unusual romantic strategy, but Zeus was nothing if not experimental. His behaviour would be baffling if it weren't so consistent. Again and again, he fell into passion, deceit, and eventual regret. Each story began with thunder and ended in chaos. And every time, Hera, his wife, Queen of Olympus, and long-suffering partner, was left to pick up the emotional debris. But to understand why being married to Zeus was so dreadful, one must first grasp what Zeus was to the Greeks. Not simply a personified sky, but the very embodiment of fate and authority. His word was law, and law in the ancient world was rarely fair to those beneath it. In art and literature, Zeus was portrayed as regal and muscular, his expression somewhere between stern justice and smug certainty. The sculptors of the classical period gave him broad shoulders and calm eyes, as though he'd never once lost his temper, which is generous, given that the myths tell a different story. The Homeric poems describe him as easily angered, occasionally sentimental, and frequently distracted. When mortals offended him, he sent storms or floods. When gods disobeyed, he threw them from Olympus. Once, when his son Hephaestus tried to defend Hera during one of their arguments, Zeus hurled him off the mountain entirely. He landed with a limp that never healed. It says something about the family dynamic that this counted as a typical Tuesday. Even his court was run on drama. Poseidon, his brother, resented his authority. Hades kept his distance in the shadows. Athena and Apollo advised him when he cared to listen, while Hermes acted as the diplomatic fixer of divine mistakes, and presiding over it all was Zeus, the eternal patriarch, generous when pleased, vengeful when crossed, and utterly insufferable in victory. Historians and classicists have long noted that Zeus's character evolved over centuries. The early Mycenaeans worshipped him as a storm god, Dios, a name whispered with awe during thunder. Later, in the classical era, he became the father of gods and men, the symbol of cosmic order, what the Greeks called Dike. His lightning bolts weren't just weapons, they were symbols of divine justice, punishing hubris and restoring balance. Except, of course, when he used them for personal irritation. If a mortal dared to challenge the gods, or worse, ignored his advances, thunder followed. Semele, a Theban princess, was tricked by Hera into asking Zeus to reveal himself in his full divine form. When he did, his lightning consumed her instantly. It's an interesting kind of romance, one that leaves very little room for long-term companionship. To the ancient mind, though, such stories weren't moral warnings about Zeus. They were reminders of the gulf between gods and mortals. His unpredictability wasn't a flaw. It was proof of his divinity. Power, after all, needed no justification. From the human point of view, Zeus was everywhere. His temples crowned city hills. His statues guarded marketplaces. Sacrifices of bulls and rams were made in his honour, the smoke rising toward his celestial throne. The Greeks called him Zeus Xenios, the god of hospitality, because any traveller might secretly be under his protection. They also called him Zeus Horkios, guardian of oaths. Ironic, given his personal record with vows of fidelity, is that contradiction that makes him fascinating. Zeus was both protector and offender, father and tyrant, the one who upheld order, and the one who constantly disrupted it. He was, in short, every king the ancient world had ever known, grand, powerful, and impossible to live with. And that brings us back to the central tragedy. Hera, she was his equal in majesty, his wife, and the goddess of marriage itself, an irony so sharp it might cut marble. Her story begins not in romance, but in reluctant acceptance. After their wedding, Zeus celebrated by summoning clouds, rainbows, and celestial music. Yet even before the last echo faded, his old habits were stirring again. Hera would come to represent every wronged wife in mythology, her fury legendary, her endurance even more so. But that's another story, one we'll wander into soon enough. For now, as the thunder fades into soft rain and Olympus settles into uneasy quiet, it's worth remembering that Zeus, despite his glory, was less a god of peace than of restless energy. His terrible habits shaped not only his marriage, but the entire mythic world around him. The heavens, the earth, and the underworld all bent to his will. And yet, not even the king of the gods could conquer his own impulses. If Olympus had a throne beside Zeus's, it belonged to Hera, the queen of the gods, goddess of marriage, childbirth, and the sort of patience that could only be forged in divine misery. She was majestic, poised, and relentless, not only in power, but in endurance. For while Zeus ruled the sky, Hera ruled the silence that followed his every thunderclap. In the ancient Greek world, Hera was one of the most deeply revered goddesses. Her temples at Argos and Samos stood as architectural marvels centuries before the Parthenon people prayed to her for stability in their marriages, for fertility, and for the well-being of the household. She was the divine embodiment of union. Except, of course, for her marriage to Zeus was the ancient equivalent of a mythological cautionary tale, a partnership built on lightning and resentment. According to myth, Zeus pursued Hera with the same persistence he showed toward nearly everyone he wanted. She wasn't easy to impress, though. Hera knew his reputation, and being his sister, she knew him rather too well. Zeus resorted to trickery, which, in his defense, seemed to be his favorite form of courtship. He transformed himself into a helpless cuckoo bird, shivering in the rain outside her window. Moved by pity, Hera gathered the trembling bird against her chest to warm it. That's when Zeus transformed back into himself, declaring that her compassion had bound them together. One imagines the conversation that followed was awkward. Their wedding, however, was magnificent. All the gods attended, nymphs danced, and the earth itself supposedly blossomed with new flowers. The divine couple was celebrated as the ideal union of masculine and feminine power. Order and authority joined forever. It was, as these things often are, a symbol of hope and a warning all at once, because, as the poets like to remind their audiences, Zeus's promises tended to last precisely as long as his attention span. From the beginning, Hera faced what we might call an occupational hazard. Zeus, ever restless, was prone to wandering affections. His transformations, swan, bull, cloud, golden rain, were famous throughout Greece. Each new affair brought another mortal woman elevated, ruined, or both, and Hera was expected to carry herself with dignity through it all. The Greeks never described Hera as naive. Quite the opposite. She was sharp, calculating, and utterly unwilling to accept humiliation quietly, but she was bound by the divine order of things. She couldn't leave Zeus, not when her very domain was the sanctity of marriage itself. To abandon it would be to unmake part of her own power. So she endured, and in enduring, she became fearsome. When the ancient playwrights wrote about her, they gave her a complex kind of wrath, not blind jealousy, but a queen's wounded pride. Aeschylus and Homer both portray her as politically intelligent, often acting against Zeus when she believed he was unjust. Yet, no matter how cunning her schemes, the cosmic balance always restored Zeus to dominance. Hera's story, then, is one of eternal opposition, resistance without victory. It didn't help that Olympus itself was a nest of gossip. Every divine infidelity became a celestial headline. When Zeus disguised himself as a shepherd to woo Io, Hera noticed the sudden appearance of an unusually beautiful cow. She asked to have it as a gift, and when Zeus reluctantly handed it over, she placed the 100-eyed giant Argus to guard it. Zeus, naturally, sent Hermes to lull Argus to sleep and kill him. When Hera discovered this, she honoured Argus by setting his eyes in the tail of her sacred bird, the peacock that the poet said is why peacocks have jewelled feathers, a reminder of loyalty, watchfulness, and an unfortunate cow. Another time, Zeus's affair with Semele, a mortal princess, produced Dionysus, but only after Hera tricked Semele into asking to see Zeus in his true divine form. The sight incinerated her instantly. It's difficult to know whether Hera felt satisfaction or sorrow. Either way, the event cemented her reputation among mortals as a goddess not to be crossed. In many ways, Hera's anger became her mythology. Her fury against Heracles, Zeus's most famous illegitimate son, is legendary. She sent serpents to kill him in his cradle, and when that failed, she spent much of his life ensuring his labours were as miserable as possible. Yet, in an oddly poetic twist, even her vengeance helped shape the heroes of Greek myth. Without her opposition, there would have been no Heracles as we know him, no trials, no triumphs. Her cruelty became the forge of courage. But beneath the rage lies something more human. The Greeks understood Hera as a tragic figure, not a villain. Her temple hymns call her golden-throned and cow-eyed, not insults, but terms of beauty and majesty. She represented the ideal of feminine sovereignty, loyal yet proud, nurturing yet capable of destruction when wronged. In a world where most women had little power, Hera embodied both the burden and the defiance of it. In art, she appears serene and regal, a crown upon her head, a sceptre in her hand. But look closely at her depictions on vases and frescoes, and you can see the tension in her gaze. She is never fully at ease. Even when sitting beside Zeus, her posture is slightly withdrawn, her expression unreadable. Historians believe this visual language was deliberate. A reflection of her mythic reality, Hera is both queen and captive. The ancient Greeks didn't pity her. They respected her. Her temples were among the oldest in Greece, and her worship often centered around rites of marriage and fertility. The Heraion of Samos, for example, was so large that its columns rivaled any in the Mediterranean. Women would offer her locks of hair or miniature figures to bless their unions, silently hoping their husbands would not resemble hers. Even in religion, though, there was a quiet irony. The goddess of marriage was invoked to bless harmony, yet her own story was a monument to discord. This duality fascinated ancient thinkers. The philosopher Pausanias described Hera as both maiden and matron, eternal bride and eternal widow. In her, the Greeks saw not perfection but endurance, a symbol that even divine unions could be fraught, fragile, and flawed. Zeus, for his part, seemed fond of her. In his own unhelpful way, their arguments shook Olympus. Their reconciliations were theatrical, and their dynamic was complicated. Once, in Homer's Iliad, Hera seduced Zeus to distract him during the Trojan War, hoping to aid the Greeks while he slept. She borrowed Aphrodite's girdle, a magical belt of irresistible allure, and approached Zeus on Mount Ida. The king of the gods was utterly undone. Forgetting the war entirely, it was the divine equivalent of hitting pause on world events. It's hard not to admire her strategy. Even in myth, Hera wielded charm and cunning to regain a small measure of control. Yet, as always, her victories were temporary. Zeus eventually woke, furious but begrudgingly impressed, and Olympus returned to its uneasy peace. In the end, Hera's story is not about defeat or triumph. It's about endurance in a world ruled by capricious power. She remained queen not because she was happy, but because she was inevitable. Like the institution of marriage itself, she persisted through storms and silences alike. For the Greeks, that made her sacred. To suffer without surrender, that was divine. So, as the clouds gather again above Olympus and thunder hums faintly in the distance, imagine Hera sitting upon her golden throne, eyes calm, thoughts unreadable somewhere. Zeus is charming another mortal. Somewhere else, another myth is beginning. And Hera, patient, proud, and quietly furious, watches the sky, waiting for it to pass. If there's one thing Zeus excelled at besides thunder, it was trouble. The kind that began with a charming smile and ended with a woman being turned into something unfortunate. His reputation for romance would be impressive if it weren't also catastrophic. Mortals, goddesses, and nymphs alike learn that catching the eye of Zeus was roughly as safe as standing on a hill during a lightning storm. For the Greeks, these stories were more than gossip. They were explanations of divine power, natural phenomena, and human misfortune. To us, they read like a long catalogue of celestial bad behaviour. To Hera, they must have felt like a nightmare that repeated every century. Zeus's romances usually followed a pattern: transformation, pursuit, calamity. One of the earliest was with Io, a priestess of Hera herself. Io was said to be beautiful, pious, and unfortunately located in Zeus's line of sight. When Zeus approached her, the sky darkened, not from storm clouds, but from a deliberate cover, a convenient fog to hide his mischief. Hera, however, noticed the sudden weather change and came investigating Zeus, caught mid-seduction, panicked, and transformed Io into a snow-white cow. Hera was unconvinced. She asked for the cow as a gift, and Zeus, trapped by his own lie, had no choice but to hand her over Hera, then set Argus, a giant with 100 eyes, to watch Io day and night. Eventually, Zeus sent Hermes to lull Argus to sleep with music and kill him, freeing Io but Hera, not one to waste symbolism, took Argus's eyes and placed them on the tail of her sacred bird, the peacock. Even today, its shimmering eyes are said to watch the world for her. Io, meanwhile, was chased across the earth by a stinging gadfly Hera sent in revenge. Her wanderings became so famous that ancient geographers traced her journey from Greece to Egypt. It's quite the travel story, though not one she volunteered for. Then there was Europa, the Phoenician princess. Zeus spotted her gathering flowers by the sea, and, deciding introductions were overrated, transformed himself into a beautiful white bull. Europa, finding the creature gentle, climbed onto its back. Instantly, the bull bolted into the waves, carrying her far from home to the island of Crete. There, Zeus revealed himself, and Europa became the mother of 3 sons, including Minos, the future king of Crete. It's one of the more famous myths of abduction disguised as love, and the Greeks thought of it as a foundational story linking their island kingdoms to divine ancestry. Her name, Europa, would later lend itself to an entire continent, as if to suggest that even a continent begins with a poor decision and a very persuasive bull. Another famous tale, and perhaps the strangest, was that of Leda and the swan. One evening, the Spartan queen was bathing by a river when Zeus descended from the heavens as a swan. Pursued by an eagle, she took pity on the trembling bird and drew it into her arms, a mistake mortals seemed destined to repeat. From that union, she laid 2 eggs, from which hatched Helen, later of Troy, Clytemnestra, and the twin heroes Castor and Pollux. The story fascinated ancient artists. On vases, mosaics, and sculptures, the serene Leda often gazes down at the elegant bird in her arms, her expression caught between curiosity and resignation. It was less about romance, more about the unpredictable closeness between gods and mortals, and how dangerous that could be. Zeus was not exclusive in his transformations. He became a shower of golden light for Danae, who was locked away in a bronze chamber by her father. Her father, King Acrisius of Argos, had been warned that his grandson would one day kill him, so he imprisoned his daughter to prevent her from bearing a child Zeus, not one to let architecture interfere with his hobbies, appeared through the roof as a glittering cascade of gold. Danae conceived Perseus, the future slayer of Medusa. It's a beautiful image, divine light, miraculous birth, until you remember that for the Greeks this was a story about inevitability. No matter what mortals did to escape fate, Zeus's will or desire would find its way in. And then there was Semele, daughter of Cadmus and mother of Dionysus. Hera, ever the tactician, disguised herself as Semele's old nurse, and whispered a poisonous suggestion. If Zeus truly loved her, he should show himself in his divine form. Semele, naive but determined, made the request. Bound by his oath, Zeus appeared in his full brilliance. Lightning, fire, and power beyond mortal endurance, Semele was consumed instantly, leaving behind their unborn child. Zeus, feeling a pang of divine guilt, sewed the baby into his thigh until it was ready to be born. Thus came Dionysus, god of wine, theatre, and reckless celebration. Quite fitting, given his parentage. The myth was often interpreted as an allegory for revelation, that to see the divine truth directly was fatal. But for Hera, it was just another tragedy added to an already long list. To mortals, these stories were reminders that the gods existed on their own terms. But from Hera's throne, they looked like serial betrayals. Each affair was not only personal, but political. Every new demigod, born to a mortal woman, shifted Olympus's balance of power. Zeus's children, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Hermes, Dionysus, Perseus, Heracles, filled a world with glory and chaos alike. The irony was that Zeus's family, for all its grandeur, was held together by rivalry and resentment. Athena, born fully armed from his head, became a goddess of wisdom and strategy, but only after Zeus swallowed her mother, Metis, to prevent her from bearing a son more powerful than him. It worked technically, but the result was no less peculiar. Hera must have watched that episode with the weary understanding of someone whose husband had again taken things too literally. There's an old saying in Greek myth that every great hero has Zeus to thank for his parentage, and Hera to thank for his misery. Heracles, Perseus, and countless others all suffered divine punishments, not for their own sins, but for being living proof of Zeus's faithlessness. The Greeks, to their credit, found this perfectly natural. The gods were reflections of their own society. Powerful men, patient women, and the constant negotiation between pride and endurance. The storytellers of the time didn't moralize these tales the way later cultures might. Zeus wasn't condemned for his infidelities because, in a strange way, they were seen as the expression of cosmic vitality. His desire was life-giving, his passions creative, though his methods left much to be desired. Hera's rage, in turn, symbolized the world's necessary correction, the moral weight that followed divine excess. In temples and homes across Greece, people still prayed to both Zeus and Hera side by side. Farmers asked Zeus for rain, and couples asked Hera for fidelity. It's an arrangement that only makes sense if you accept that contradiction is part of nature itself. Thunder and calm, betrayal and endurance. Husband and wife sharing the same altar despite everything. From a mortal's perspective, one might feel sorry for Hera, but to the Greeks, her story wasn't meant to inspire pity. It was meant to explain why life could be both sacred and unfair at once. Every storm had its lightning, every wedding its shadow. So, when you next imagine Mount Olympus gleaming above the clouds, picture Zeus reclining on his throne, looking terribly pleased with himself. Somewhere below, a princess hears thunder and wonders why the air feels different tonight. And in the great hall beside him, Hera sits, eyes half closed, the faintest sigh escaping her lips. The sound of a queen who knows it's going to rain again soon. When mortals prayed to Hera, they called her Queen of Heaven. But among the gods, she was something far more formidable. A woman wronged too many times to count, who had learned that patience was simply the long pause before vengeance for Hera. Every betrayal from Zeus was followed by a plan, a scheme, or a curse. She was not a goddess of forgiveness. She was a goddess of memory, and she remembered everything. Her anger was never impulsive like Zeus's thunder. It was careful, almost ceremonial. She didn't strike her husband directly. That would be pointless. No, Hera turned her fury toward what Zeus loved most, his paramours and their offspring. Some called it cruelty, others justice. Either way, Olympus trembled whenever Hera fell silent, for it meant she was thinking one of her earliest victims was Echo, a mountain nymph whose crime was conversation. Echo was clever, playful, and had a voice like sunlight. Bright, warm, impossible to ignore. Whenever Zeus slipped away from Olympus for his escapades, Echo would distract Hera with endless chatter, spinning tales and jokes until Zeus had finished whatever he was doing down on Earth. Hera, after realizing she'd been duped, punished Echo not with death, but with humiliation. She took away her ability to speak freely, allowing her only to repeat the last word spoken to her. From that day forward, Echo's voice became nothing more than a reflection of others. It's one of those myths that sounds cruel but poetic, a goddess's wrath etched into the natural world. The Greeks said that even centuries later, if you shouted into the hills, it was Echo still trying to have the last word. Then there was Io, poor, unfortunate Io, who was once a priestess of Hera herself. Her devotion should have earned her divine favour, but instead it drew Zeus's attention. When Hera noticed the sudden cloud cover and suspicious silence one afternoon, she descended from Olympus and found her husband standing beside a gleaming white cow, Zeus, improvising badly. Explained that it was just a normal cow he had found wandering the fields. Hera smiled that dangerous smile only wives of gods can manage, and asked to have the cow as a gift. Trapped by his own lie, Zeus handed Io over. Hera then appointed a guardian, Argus, a giant with 100 eyes, who never slept fully but only rested half his eyes at a time. Io was forced to graze the fields under his unblinking watch, her human consciousness trapped inside a cow's body. Eventually Zeus sent Hermes to rescue her. The messenger god lulled Argus to sleep with his flute and killed him. When Hera discovered what had happened, she didn't waste her anger. Instead, she took Argus's eyes and placed them on the tail of her sacred bird, the peacock, so he could watch forever. Still not satisfied, she sent a biting gadfly to torment Io, who fled across the world in misery, through Greece, across the Bosporus, and finally to Egypt, where she gave birth to Zeus's child. The Greeks claimed her wandering path marked rivers and coastlines, as if Hera had stitched her vengeance into the geography itself. But it was Heracles who felt Hera's fury most of all. From the moment of his birth, she despised him. He was the living proof of Zeus's faithlessness. Strong, noble, and inconveniently heroic. Hera tried to prevent his birth by sending the goddess of childbirth to sit cross-legged at his mother's door, whispering spells to delay labour. But a clever maid tricked the goddess by shouting, "A child is born." The words startled her, breaking the spell, and Heracles entered the world. Hera, hearing the news, sent 2 serpents to kill him in his cradle. The infant strangled them both before his parents even arrived. That was Hera's first defeat, but certainly not her last attempt. As Heracles grew older, she plagued him with misfortunes. At one point, she struck him with madness so deep that he murdered his own family, after which he was condemned to complete 12 impossible labours to atone. It was Hera who inspired the challenges: the monstrous lion, the multi-headed hydra, the stables, the deadly mares, each one designed to break him. And yet, every time he survived, his legend grew. Her vengeance had backfired spectacularly. The hero she sought to destroy became one of Greece's greatest, worshipped by mortals, and eventually raised to Olympus as a god. And in a final twist that could only be described as Zeus's idea of humour, Heracles was married to Hera's own daughter, Hebe, the goddess of youth. Even for a queen of the heavens, that must have been hard to smile through. Hera's wrath reached even further, into wars, kingdoms, and generations yet unborn. Her anger at the Trojan prince Paris, for instance, reshaped the ancient world. It all began at a wedding. Not hers, thankfully, but that of the mortal Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis. Every god and goddess was invited except one. Eris, the goddess of discord, furious, Eris arrived anyway, tossing a golden apple into the crowd with the words, "To the fairest," inscribed upon it. 3 goddesses claimed it: Aphrodite, Athena, and Hera's Zeus, being unwilling to choose among them, he'd learned something from experience, appointed Paris of Troy to judge. Each goddess offered him a bribe. Hera promised power, Athena promised wisdom and victory, and Aphrodite promised the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. Paris chose Aphrodite, earning Hera's eternal hatred. When the Trojan War later erupted, Hera made certain Troy would burn. She supported the Greeks with unrelenting fervour, manipulating gods, storms, and heroes until the city was ash to mortals, her vengeance might have seemed excessive. But to Hera, it was justice, drawn out over years. Not quick retribution, but patient correction. Every deceit had its echo, every betrayal its reckoning. And yet, even her victories carried sorrow. No amount of divine punishment could undo the simple truth. Zeus would never stop, and Hera could never leave. In this endless cycle, she became something larger than vengeance. She became inevitability itself, the divine embodiment of reaction, the eternal consequence to every thunderbolt thrown in passion. The Greeks saw this not as cruelty, but as balance. Zeus represented impulse, Hera represented order. Together they kept the universe, however dysfunctional, in motion. When ancient artists painted her, they often gave her a calm, unreadable face. Serene, yet dangerous, like still water that hides its depth, that was Hera's greatest power. The dignity that endured, even through humiliation. Her revenge was not the tantrum of a jealous wife. It was the mechanism of cosmic fairness, expressed in lightning, madness, and myth. So, as the night settles over Olympus and the gods sleep, or pretend to, you can almost imagine Hera sitting by her window of clouds, looking down on the mortal world somewhere below. Another woman stirs from a dream of thunder. Somewhere else, a hero wakes to a new trial. And above them all, Hera watches, not with fury anymore, but with that quiet, knowing calm of someone who understands that storms always come back around. Zeus was never short on offspring. In fact, if there were ever a divine census taken, half of Olympus and a worrying portion of the mortal world would have had to list Zeus in the father's column. Each child carried some spark of his power, and each birth was followed by a storm, literal or otherwise. For Hera, these children weren't just reminders of betrayal. They were living monuments to her husband's inability to behave himself. The Greek poets loved to catalogue Zeus's progeny, each one more improbable than the last. There were gods, demigods, heroes, and monsters, all born from unions that ranged from passionate to absurd. It wasn't just romantic recklessness, it was divine politics. Every child expanded Zeus's influence, tying kingdoms, cities, and mythic lineages to his name. If the mortal world was a map, Zeus's children were the ink that connected it all. Hera, however, saw only the stains. Among the earliest and most famous of these children was Athena, born not from a mother's womb, but from Zeus's skull, a metaphor that should have been a warning about the headaches this family would bring. The story goes that Zeus, fearing a prophecy that his lover Metis would bear a child more powerful than him, swallowed her whole for a while. Everything was fine, until Zeus began to complain of a terrible pain in his head. Hephaestus, the god of the forge, helpfully split his skull open with an axe, and out sprang Athena, fully grown, wearing armour and holding a spear. It was a birth both brilliant and unsettling. Hera, understandably, was not pleased. Zeus had somehow managed to produce a child without her, and one of immense wisdom and authority at that. Athena became his favourite, seated beside his throne, advising him on war and law. Hera's jealousy was not petty here, it was political. In the divine hierarchy, she was supposed to be queen, yet now there stood another woman who shared Zeus's counsel and admiration. Not all of Zeus's children were so noble. Hermes, born of the nymph Maia, arrived with charm, cunning, and a complete lack of boundaries. Within hours of his birth, he had stolen Apollo's cattle and invented the lyre to bargain his way out of trouble. Zeus adored him, of course. It takes one trickster to appreciate another. Hera, meanwhile, regarded Hermes as yet another example of Zeus rewarding mischief while expecting her to maintain decorum. Then came Apollo and Artemis, twin children of the Titaness Leto. Their mother's story is one of divine persecution. Hera, upon learning of Leto's pregnancy, forbade any land touched by sunlight to offer her shelter. The earth trembled under the curse until a small floating island, Delos, took pity on Leto and allowed her to give birth. There, under swaying palms and the watch of sympathetic nymphs, Apollo and Artemis were born, the god of the sun and the goddess of the moon. Hera's vengeance had failed again, though not for lack of effort. In mythic terms, the twins' brilliance was born directly out of Hera's cruelty, as if the universe enjoyed turning spite into beauty. Perhaps the most dramatic of Zeus's mortal children was Perseus, born of Danae. Her father, King Acrisius of Argos, had locked her in a bronze chamber after hearing a prophecy that her son would one day cause his death. But Zeus, not one to be stopped by architecture, entered her prison as a shower of golden light. From that union came Perseus, the hero who would later slay Medusa and rescue Andromeda. Hera, curiously, left him alone. Perhaps she considered the situation beneath her notice, or perhaps even she knew that some fates were better left unprovoked. Heracles, however, was another matter entirely. He was the most famous of all Zeus's mortal children, and Hera's sworn enemy from the moment he drew breath. She tormented him through madness and misfortune, forcing him to perform 12 impossible labours as penance for the crimes she drove him to commit. And yet, every hardship only strengthened his legend. By the end of his mortal life, Zeus raised him to Olympus as a god. Hera, after centuries of hatred, was forced to accept him as family. In a gesture of divine irony, she even gave him her daughter Hebe as a bride. Perhaps forgiveness was never the goal, only exhaustion. Another of Zeus's more tragic liaisons was with Semele, the mortal mother of Dionysus. Hera, disguised as an old nurse, convinced Semele to ask Zeus to reveal his true divine form. When he did, the sight of his glory consumed her instantly, leaving only the unborn child behind. Zeus rescued the infant by sewing him into his thigh until he was ready to be born. Dionysus grew into the god of wine, madness and ecstasy, proof that even the ashes of Hera's vengeance could blossom into celebration. And then there were the countless nameless children, rustic gods, river spirits, and local heroes, each a ripple of Zeus's mischief. The Greeks told their stories not just to glorify Zeus, but to explain the messy, unpredictable nature of life itself. Storms, floods, strange births, all could be traced back to the moods of the sky and its king. Hera's anger, in that sense, was not just personal, it was cosmic housekeeping. Someone had to respond to the chaos he created. It's easy to imagine Olympus as a household constantly on edge. One divine scandal away from collapse. Hera, regal but weary, presiding over a court full of Zeus's illegitimate children, each demanding recognition. The air must have been thick with polite tension, as if the clouds themselves preferred not to get involved. Yet for all her bitterness, Hera sometimes showed flashes of reluctant grace. She protected certain heroes, aided women in childbirth, and remained a symbol of lawful union, even when her own was anything but. It's a strange paradox. The goddess of marriage maintaining divine order in a family that constantly defied it. But perhaps that was her purpose all along. Without Hera's restraint, Olympus might have torn itself apart centuries earlier. By the time of the later poets, even Zeus's own legends began to tire under their repetition. New gods emerged, quieter, humbler deities of hearth, harvest and boundaries. The grand dramas of Olympus faded into old tales told by lamplight, but Hera and Zeus remained, locked forever in their uneasy alliance. Their children roamed the earth and the stars, symbols of glory born from disorder. For Hera, each child was a reminder that her marriage was both divine and doomed, a union that shaped the world but never brought her peace. And yet she stayed. Not out of love, perhaps, but because she embodied something larger. The idea that even chaos must have its queen. So when you look up at the night sky, at the constellations of Perseus, the twins of Gemini, or the shining belt of Orion, remember that somewhere behind those stars lies a weary goddess, sitting beside her husband's throne, surrounded by the children of his betrayals. The heavens are quiet now, but she remembers them all. Mount Olympus may have been the seat of divine power, but it was also the most complicated workplace in the universe. A glittering, thunderous palace filled with family drama, politics, and the kind of gossip that would make mortal courts blush. Every god had a domain, every goddess a reputation, and almost everyone had a reason to quietly resent Zeus. From the outside, Olympus looked serene. Marble halls glowed in the light of eternal dawn, clouds drifted lazily around its golden gates, and divine music played in the distance. Yet behind those shining doors, the gods were whispering about who Zeus had turned into a bull for this week, which mortal was expecting divine twins, and how Hera had once again sent a suspiciously poetic curse into the mortal realm. The thing about Olympus was that everyone knew better than to confront Zeus directly. He was the king of the gods after all, master of storms, upholder of oaths, and the one with a literal lightning arsenal. You didn't criticize a man who could smite you mid-sentence, but you could, and did, talk about him endlessly behind his back. Poseidon, Zeus's brother, was the least subtle about it. The sea god never quite forgave Zeus for dividing the cosmos and keeping the sky for himself. Whenever Zeus's affairs caused celestial chaos, Poseidon would mutter about irresponsible leadership, while stirring up a small hurricane. Just for emphasis, their sibling rivalry spanned centuries. The Greeks saw it as a reflection of nature itself. Thunder above, waves below, each trying to drown out the other. Hades, the other brother, avoided Olympus entirely. He stayed in the underworld, tending to the dead, far from Zeus's constant commotion. He ruled quietly, rarely interfering in divine quarrels. Some said he simply didn't have the patience for Zeus's theatrics. Others suggested he found the afterlife less exhausting than Olympus family dinners. It's easy to imagine Hades sitting by the river Styx, sipping his wine in peace, murmuring, "At least it's quiet down here." Athena, Zeus's favourite daughter, often found herself acting as his unofficial diplomat. Calm, wise and strategic. She was the only one who could occasionally talk sense into him. When Hera's temper rose, Athena would be the one to smooth things over. Though she must have known she was also a source of her stepmother's irritation, Hera respected Athena's intelligence, but never forgot that Zeus had birthed her alone, without a mother. Every time the two women exchanged polite greetings in Olympus's great hall, the tension could have sliced a thunderbolt in half. Then there was Hermes, the messenger god. Clever, charming, and utterly untrustworthy when it came to secrets. Hermes knew everything that happened on Olympus, often before it happened. His sandals carried him between heaven and earth, and his tongue carried gossip just as efficiently. It was Hermes who first spread word of Zeus's golden reign with Danae, who let slip details of his ball disguise for Europa, and who accidentally told Apollo about the swan incident. He was the divine embodiment of "don't tell anyone," immediately followed by "you'll never believe this." Aphrodite, goddess of love, found Zeus's escapades amusing rather than scandalous. Love to her was chaos by design. She would sit among the other goddesses, idly combing her golden hair, remarking that at least Zeus kept things interesting. Hera despised her for it, though perhaps secretly envied her freedom. Even Apollo and Artemis, the radiant twins of Leto, carried complicated feelings toward their divine father. Apollo admired Zeus's power, but distrusted his inconsistency. Artemis, fierce and independent, avoided him entirely. She had seen what happened to mortal women who caught Zeus's attention and preferred the safety of her moonlit forests to Olympus's crowded feasts. And then, of course, there was Hephaestus, Hera's son, the god of fire and craftsmanship. He had been thrown from Olympus as an infant, crippled by the fall, when Zeus lost his temper during an argument. Later, when the gods needed weapons and palaces, they conveniently invited him back. Hephaestus never forgot the insult, though he masked it with calm precision. It was he who built Hera's golden throne, a masterpiece of craftsmanship, and, secretly, a trap. When she sat upon it, the throne seized her, holding her fast. The other gods begged Hephaestus to release her, but he refused until Zeus promised him Aphrodite as his wife. That marriage, predictably, didn't go well either. The Olympian household was a constant balancing act, not just of power, but of appearance. To mortals, the gods were a model of order and divinity. To each other, they were a collection of egos held together by ceremony and avoidance. Festivals were thrown in Zeus's honour, and everyone smiled politely, pretending not to remember who he had offended last week. It's worth remembering that for the Greeks, their gods were not paragons of virtue. They were mirrors of humanity at its grandest and pettiest. The family feuds of Olympus explained the chaos of nature and politics alike. Zeus's thunder symbolized authority. Hera's silence, the persistence of justice, and the endless squabbles of their children reflected the struggles of every city-state trying to coexist. There was, in all of it, a kind of balance. When Zeus acted recklessly, Hera restored equilibrium. When tempers rose among the gods, Athena calmed them. When diplomacy failed, Hermes distracted everyone with a new story. It was divine bureaucracy. Disorder transformed into ritual. The world below kept turning because somehow the heavens managed to remain mostly intact. Still, one imagines the awkwardness of the daily meetings. Hera presiding beside Zeus, every god pretending not to glance at the messenger, who carried the latest scandal, Apollo strumming his lyre too loudly to drown out the tension, Demeter refusing to speak to anyone until her missing daughter was returned from the underworld, and in the midst of it all, Zeus, smiling faintly, as though genuinely unaware that he was the source of everyone's stress. Hera endured it all with the patience of someone who understood that dignity, not victory, was her only defence. Her throne gleamed beside his, not out of affection, but out of necessity. The Greeks saw her not as powerless, but as constant, the immovable counterweight to Zeus's endless movement. Without her, Olympus might have flown apart like a broken constellation. When poets described the divine banquets, they spoke of golden cups and immortal ambrosia, of laughter that shook the clouds. But if you listen closely between the lines, you can almost hear the weary sighs, the whispered alliances, the soft clinking of restraint. Olympus was less a paradise than a family dinner that never ended, with thunder as background music. And through it all, Hera kept her poise. She did not shout. She did not plead. She simply watched, listened, and remembered. Power, she knew, was not only in thunder, but in silence, in the ability to outlast chaos, and that she did beautifully. So while Zeus's affairs made legends, Hera's composure made history. Her quiet endurance became the foundation of Olympus itself, the thread that held the heavens together, even as its ruler unravelled it, one scandal at a time. When Zeus looked down from Olympus, he didn't see mortals the way humans see one another. To him, they were as fleeting as sparks from his own lightning, bright for a moment, then gone. And yet, somehow, he found them irresistible. Time and again, he descended from his throne to chase mortal women, leaving behind chaos, heartbreak, and a very long list of half-divine offspring. For Zeus, these encounters were acts of passion. For the mortals involved, they were often tragedies waiting to happen. To understand these myths, you have to think the way the ancient Greeks did. The gods weren't moral beings. They were forces of nature, vast, unpredictable, and unconcerned with fairness. When Zeus fell in love, it wasn't romance, it was weather. It happened suddenly, violently, and mortals could do little more than survive it. The story of Danae is one of the most famous examples. She was a princess of Argos, locked away in a bronze tower by her father, King Acrisius. An oracle had warned him that his daughter would one day bear a son who would kill him. So he did what all mythological fathers did when faced with prophecy. He overreacted dramatically. He sealed her in an underground chamber, away from men and daylight. But prophecies in Greek myth are like rivers. They always find their way. Zeus visited Danae not as a man, but as a shower of golden light. It must have been dazzling. Divine radiance falling like sunlight through cracks in the bronze walls. From that impossible encounter came Perseus, who would one day slay Medusa, and yes, fulfill the prophecy. Acrisius' attempt to defy fate only made it happen, and Zeus. He was long gone by then, off chasing someone else. There was Alcmene too, the mother of Heracles. Zeus disguised himself as her husband, while the man was away at war, and visited her for a single, extraordinarily long night. When the real husband returned, there were 2 sons, one mortal, one divine. Hera's rage was immediate and lifelong. She sent serpents to the infant's cradle, then madness to his adult mind. Heracles' strength and suffering both came from the single deceit. A god's brief pleasure paid for with a hero's lifetime of pain. And then came Leda, the queen of Sparta, who was visited by Zeus in the form of a swan. It sounds ridiculous. A swan. But to the Greeks it symbolized seduction wrapped in softness. The divine disguised as the harmless, the union produced eggs from which hatched Helen, later of Troy, whose beauty would ignite a war lasting 10 years. It's difficult not to notice the pattern. Zeus's affairs had a way of rewriting history, while leaving others to deal with the aftermath. Callisto's story was even darker. She was one of Artemis's followers, a virgin huntress sworn to chastity. Zeus disguised himself as Artemis to trick her, a deceit that even the ancient storytellers found disturbing. When Callisto gave birth to a son, Hera's fury erupted. She transformed Callisto into a bear and sent her wandering through the forests, hunted by the very companions she once called sisters. Years later, her son, grown into a hunter, unknowingly aimed his spear at her. Zeus intervened at the last moment, placing them both in the stars as Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, the Great Bear and Little Bear, a family portrait written in starlight, born of tragedy. Semele's tale might be the most haunting of them all. A mortal princess of Thebes, she caught Zeus's eye, and soon she was pregnant Hera, disguised as an old nurse, visited her with gentle, poisonous words. "If Zeus truly loves you," she said, "make him show himself to you as he appears to Hera." It was advice laced with death. When Zeus came again, Semele asked her wish, and he, bound by oath, could not refuse. He revealed himself in all his divine glory, lightning, fire, radiance unbearable to mortal sight. Semele was consumed instantly, leaving only her unborn child behind. Zeus sewed the baby into his thigh until it was ready to be born. And thus came Dionysus, god of wine and madness, the only god born twice. Mortals often paid the price for Zeus's whims long after he'd gone. Their children, though gifted, lived uneasy lives. They carried both human fragility and divine expectation. Belonging fully to neither world, Perseus was haunted by prophecy, Heracles by guilt, Dionysus by madness. Even Helen of Troy, said to be the most beautiful of all women, found her life turned into legend by men who went to war over her. None of them had asked to be born into such chaos. But that was the nature of Zeus's affection: brief, brilliant, and ruinous. To the Greeks, these myths explained the unpredictability of fate. The gods' desires shaped the world the way storms shape mountains, leaving beauty, destruction, and rivers of consequence behind. Zeus's pursuit of mortals blurred the line between heaven and earth, reminding humanity that divine attention was as dangerous as divine wrath. Hera, of course, saw it differently. To her, each mortal woman was a fresh insult, each half-god child another scar on her pride. She couldn't strike Zeus directly, but she could make mortals feel her grief. Her vengeance followed them across generations. Semele's sisters were driven mad. Callisto was cursed to wander. Alcmene spent her life in fear. If Zeus was thunder, Hera was the echo that refused to fade. The poets, especially Hesiod and Ovid, wrote about these women with a kind of quiet awe. They were victims and symbols both, reminders that the gods were not bound by the same rules as mortals. When a human broke an oath, they were punished. When Zeus did, the sky simply rolled with thunder, and everyone pretended it was rain. Even philosophers found meaning in these tales. To them, Zeus's relationships represented the meeting of the mortal and the divine, the way inspiration, love, or catastrophe can strike from above and change the course of a life. The Greeks didn't always take the myths literally. They understood that the gods' actions were metaphors for forces beyond control. Love that burns, fate that cannot be avoided, and the arrogance of thinking one can escape either. Still, one can't help but imagine the awkwardness of it all. The mortal world trembling in awe at Zeus's thunder, not realizing that half of that storm was domestic tension. Hera, seated on her golden throne, watching the world below and thinking, another one? Really? Somewhere Hermes was probably whispering updates to Athena, and Aphrodite was sighing dreamily, insisting that love makes fools of everyone, even King Zeus himself. If he ever reflected on the chaos he caused, likely saw it as proof of his vitality, the endless reach of his will across heaven and earth. Yet for all his power, there was something pitiful about it too. His conquests never brought him peace, only more storms to manage, more hearts to mend, more apologies he never quite made. And below, in the human world, people built temples to him. They sacrificed bulls, prayed for rain, and thanked him for victories, all while quietly accepting that their god was also a source of misery. To worship Zeus was to accept contradiction. The same hand that blesses also burns. So when thunder rolled across the ancient skies, farmers might look up and mutter, "Zeus is at it again." They weren't wrong. Somewhere above the clouds, the king of the gods was smiling, while Hera, ever patient, kept count. It is easy to imagine Hera only as a storm, jealous, vengeful, and unrelenting. That is how most myths describe her. Forever raging, forever wronged. But there's another side to her, one quieter and lonelier. Beneath the crown and the thunder sat a goddess who embodied constancy in a world that refused to stay still. While Zeus roamed and Olympus gossiped, Hera endured. That endurance, more than her temper, was her true power. The Greeks called her Basileia, the queen. She was one of the eldest Olympians, sister to Zeus and his equal in birthright, if not in freedom. Before she became a figure of divine rage, she was a goddess of order, of lawful union, of sacred promises. She presided over marriage not as a sentimental ideal, but as a solemn covenant, binding, permanent, and sometimes quietly suffocating. To be the goddess of marriage in a marriage like hers must have been a divine joke, though not a funny one. Hera's temples were full of prayers from women asking for love, fertility, and peace in their homes. They lit lamps to her, offered small sacrifices, and braided her name into their wedding songs. None of them, one suspects, realized the goddess they prayed to was herself trapped in the very thing they feared, a union that could not be undone. In the oldest hymns, Hera is described not with malice, but majesty. She is golden-throned, cow-eyed, the one of noble step. The poets meant these as praises of beauty and dignity. The epithet cow-eyed, so often misunderstood, referred not to dullness, but to depth. Large, serene eyes that saw everything and gave nothing away. She was not soft, but composed. It was the kind of beauty that came with self-control, the quiet power of one who has learned to master her own heart. Yet even among gods, control had limits. Zeus's endless wanderings through mortal and immortal worlds left Hera isolated. The halls of Olympus rang with music and laughter, but Hera's chambers were silent. Every feast reminded her that her husband's affection was divided across the sky. And while the other goddesses found new lovers or retreated to their domains, Hera had nowhere else to go. Marriage was her realm, and her prison. Still she remained dutiful. When Zeus held court, she sat beside him. When mortals sacrificed in his name, her image stood beside his. To defy him would have meant unravelling the divine order itself. And Hera valued order even more than vengeance. She understood that chaos was the one thing Zeus could never resist, and the one thing she must never allow. So she stayed, regal and unyielding, the still point in a swirling cosmos of thunder and desire. The ancient world respected that strength. In cities like Argos, Samos, and Mycenae, Hera's worship was among the most ancient and revered. Her temples were older than Zeus's. Her cult, more local and personal pilgrims, brought offerings of peacock feathers, woven robes, and delicate carvings. Newly married couples would dedicate strands of hair or small wooden effigies, asking for her blessing. Archaeologists have found thousands of such offerings, tokens of gratitude or perhaps of sympathy. It seems mortals, especially women, felt a quiet kinship with her. They understood what it meant to smile through endurance. In Argos, her priestesses tended a sacred hearth that burned without ceasing, an eternal flame symbolizing the constancy of her spirit. During festivals, her image was bathed and dressed anew, not as an idol of wrath, but as a bride restored. It was a ritual of renewal, perhaps for her, perhaps for those who needed to believe that even the bitterest marriage could be made pure again, at least for a moment. On the island of Samos, the Heraion stood so vast that ancient travellers mistook it for a palace. Columns as tall as trees lined its courtyards, and the scent of incense drifted out to sea. There, Hera was honoured not as Zeus's wife, but as a sovereign in her own right, the matron of women, the guardian of legitimacy, the mother of civilization. To kneel before Hera's statue was to acknowledge the weight of vows, the gravity of commitment, and the beauty hidden in restraint. For all her anger, Hera's sense of justice was profound. She punished those who broke oaths or dishonoured their families, not merely out of spite, but because she represented the moral fabric of both heaven and earth. When mortals invoked her name, they did so in solemnity, as one might appeal to conscience itself. Even Zeus, when he wasn't provoking her, respected that about her she was the balance to his storm, the reminder that power without restraint becomes destruction. It's worth noting that in the myths, Hera never sought affection elsewhere. While other gods and goddesses pursued endless lovers, Hera's fidelity was absolute even when unrewarded. To the Greeks, this was not weakness but sovereignty. She defined herself by principle, not by Zeus's moods. Her strength was measured not in lightning bolts, but in composure, the ability to stay still when the world around her trembled. In this, she became a kind of mirror for mortal women. The Greek wife was expected to be loyal, patient, and dignified. Even in misfortune, Hera embodied both the burden and the nobility of that role. Perhaps that is why her myths carried such emotional weight. She was not an idealized goddess of charm or beauty. She was a portrait of endurance. The Greeks didn't need a perfect wife. They needed a divine reflection of the effort it took to keep life steady in the face of chaos. Over time, storytellers began to soften her image. Poets in the later classical era wrote of Hera not as a villain, but as a tragic queen, a symbol of wounded dignity. Her jealousy became less monstrous, her silence more human. They saw in her something deeply familiar, the ache of commitment, the exhaustion of duty, and the strange pride that comes from enduring. Both philosophers, too, found meaning in her steadiness. To Plato and his later interpreters, Hera represented the cosmic principle of permanence, the sustaining order that keeps the heavens in motion. Zeus might be the spark, but Hera was the structure that gave that spark purpose. Without her, divine energy would scatter into nothing. Her silence, then, was not submission, but wisdom. In art, Hera's transformation continued. On ancient vases, She stands tall beside Zeus, her veil cascading like a waterfall of gold, her expression calm but distant. She rarely looks at him. Instead, her gaze drifts outwards, towards something beyond even Olympus. Perhaps a horizon she can never reach. Her peacock stands beside her, feathers fanned in quiet splendour, its jewelled eyes glimmering like fragments of Argus's eternal watchfulness. Some artists painted her alone, seated upon a high throne of marble, her sceptre tipped with a lotus bloom. There is no anger in these portraits, only stillness, the kind of peace one earns after realizing that nothing left to break is worth breaking. Those who studied such works said they could almost hear her sigh, the sound of eternity's quiet disappointment. If Zeus was the symbol of divine power, Hera became the emblem of endurance. She was the unmovable heart of Olympus, the quiet authority that survived scandal, neglect, and betrayal. Mortals feared Zeus's wrath, but they respected Hera's silence. When storms passed, her constancy remained, a reminder that dignity is its own form of divinity. And perhaps that's why her temples outlasted his. In some places the people did not pray to her for thunder or victory. They prayed for patience, for balance, for the courage to stay when leaving wasn't an option. Hera's worshippers didn't ask her to forgive, they asked her to help them endure. So when we think of Hera, queen, wife, goddess, victim, judge, perhaps we should see not a jealous woman, but a weary sovereign sitting beneath the same stars her husband commands. Her crown is heavy, her silence immense, but her gaze is steady. The thunder may be his, but the endurance is hers. The poets ended her stories not with triumph or tragedy, but with stillness. Hera remains on her throne beside Zeus, watching, listening, and waiting. Somewhere far below, mortals light candles for her, not because she was kind, but because she understood. Zeus was the god who had everything: the throne of heaven, the worship of mortals, the respect of the gods, and the endless luxury of being right even when he wasn't. And yet, for all his power, he was never entirely in control. That was the irony of his divinity. The more he ruled, the more he was ruled. By destiny, by desire, by the very forces that defined him, he was the embodiment of authority, and the victim of it too. To the Greeks, Zeus was more than a personality. He was a principle, the idea that order, law, and justice must exist, even when they are inconvenient. They called him Zeus Xenios, the protector of guests; Zeus Horkios, the guardian of oaths; Zeus Ombrios, the bringer of rain; and Zeus Panhellenios, the unifying god of all Greeks. His presence was woven into the rhythm of daily life. A farmer praying for rain invoked him. A king swearing an oath feared him. Even a traveller setting out on the road offered him a silent nod. But while mortals saw Zeus as the embodiment of divine law, the poets saw something else. A ruler constantly testing the limits of his own authority. Every myth about Zeus carries the same strange contradiction. He is both the enforcer of order and its greatest violator. The god who punishes oathbreakers is also the god who deceives mortals. The god who upholds justice is the same one who terrifies those who cross him. It is as though Zeus himself was the storm, sometimes nourishing, sometimes devastating, but always beyond reasoning, with the philosophers noticed this too. Hesiod, in his Theogony, presents Zeus as the great stabilizer of the cosmos. After the chaos of the Titans, Zeus brings hierarchy, balance, and justice. But the poet of later centuries, especially Euripides, painted him as a figure of moral confusion. A divine king, who behaved like a flawed man. By the time of the classical age, the Greeks were already asking the uneasy question, how can the ruler of all be so human? Perhaps that was the point. The gods were never meant to be examples of virtue. They were mirrors of the human soul, magnified and eternal. Zeus's contradictions reflected humanity's own, the constant struggle between reason and impulse, justice and desire, restraint and indulgence. To pray to Zeus was to admit that power always carries temptation, that authority is never free of its own weaknesses. Even among the gods, Zeus's rule was a performance of balance. His siblings, Poseidon, Hades, Hestia, Demeter, and Hera, all carried old grievances from the Titan Wars. They owed him their places, but not necessarily their loyalty. He kept them close through ceremony and intimidation. When disputes arose among the gods, Zeus's voice decided them, but his authority depended on their belief that he was invincible. And belief, even in heaven, is a fragile thing. The mythographers like to emphasize this fragility through moments of rebellion once. Hera, Poseidon, and Athena conspired to bind Zeus in chains, tired of his arrogance. The plan nearly succeeded until the 100-handed giant Briareus, loyal to Zeus, freed him. His punishment was swift. Thunder shook the mountain, and the conspirators swore never to challenge him again. Yet the fact that such a plot could exist at all shows how precarious even divine power could be. Olympus was not a democracy, but neither was it absolute monarchy. Zeus ruled by fear and necessity, not by love. And yet there were moments, brief flashes in the myths, where Zeus showed something like tenderness. When he wept for his son Sarpedon, slain in the Trojan War, he ordered the twin gods Hypnos and Thanatos to carry the body gently home. When mortals performed their rites correctly, he blessed them with fair weather and fruitful harvests. The same hand that hurled lightning could also steady the seasons. For the Greeks, this duality was essential. A god who could not destroy was no god at all. A god who could not bless was merely a tyrant. Zeus, in his complexity, was both. His marriages and loves, disastrous as they were, also reflected this divine paradox. To mortals, his passions seemed cruel and selfish. To the poets, they were metaphors for the world itself, the union of sky and earth, of spirit and matter, of will and creation. His union with Hera represented the marriage of power and order. His affair with Demeter symbolized the fertility of the land. His pursuit of Io, transformed into a cow, mirrored the transformation of nature through suffering. Even his more scandalous escapades could be read as myths of the cosmos, where desire and creation were inseparable. Still, the human image of Zeus was difficult to reconcile. Artists carved him in marble with perfect symmetry, the broad chest of a warrior, the calm face of a judge, the eyes of one who knows everything and forgives nothing. He looked eternal. But behind that idealized form lay unease. The Greeks, more than any later civilization, understood that perfection is terrifying. To stand before Zeus's statue was to be reminded of one's own smallness, the fragility of being human in a world ruled by moods larger than weather. Historians of religion sometimes call Zeus the first moral deity of Europe, the god of justice, whose thunder enforced order. But his justice was not moral in the modern sense. It was cosmic balance, indifferent and absolute. When mortals acted with hubris, when they claimed too much, lied to the gods, or forgot humility, Zeus struck them down not because he was offended, but because the universe demanded equilibrium. The Greeks called this dike, divine justice, a principle as impersonal as gravity. Zeus did not punish out of cruelty. He simply restored the pattern. And yet, within that same system, Zeus himself constantly broke the rules. Perhaps the lesson was not that he was above justice, but that he was justice, unpredictable, vast, and beyond human comprehension. Like the weather, he could be both merciful and merciless, depending on where one happened to be standing. Hera, ever dignified, understood this better than anyone. She had learned that Zeus's power was not moral, but mechanical. He was the order that governed everything, including their marriage. Her endurance was not submission. It was understanding. She saw clearly what mortals only suspected, that Zeus's strength came not from wisdom or love, but from the impossibility of resisting what is inevitable. He was fate in a way, and even he could not escape himself. The philosophers of later ages, particularly the Stoics, would reinterpret Zeus not as a person at all, but as a principle, the divine reason, the logos that orders the cosmos. His lightning became metaphorical. Flashes of insight, the spark of destiny, the energy that holds the world together. It was a gentler way of understanding him, stripped of scandal and myth, but perhaps also of his humanity. The old poets would have found it dull, and yet, somewhere between the philosophers and the storytellers lies the truest version of Zeus, a god both magnificent and flawed, eternal yet restless, embodying every contradiction that makes existence both unbearable and beautiful. So when you picture him now, imagine not the roaring tyrant of thunder, but a weary king standing alone in a quiet sky. Below him, mortals sleep beneath the sound of distant rain. Around him, the stars burn with indifferent grace. And beside him, Hera sits in silence, unblinking, eternal. The only being in all creation who truly knows how small even the King of Gods can feel. High above the mortal world, beyond the clouds and the sound of thunder, stood a palace that glittered like dawn. Its marble halls were said to never age, its gardens forever in bloom, watered by divine rain. And in its highest chamber sat the strangest, most enduring partnership in mythology, Zeus and Hera. King and queen of the gods, husband and wife, opposites, bound not by love alone, but by necessity. For all their quarrels, betrayals, and heartbreaks, they were inseparable. The Greeks saw them not just as divine beings, but as the very pattern of the cosmos. The storm and the stillness, the will and the law, the spark and the balance. If Zeus represented power, Hera represented its limit. And between them lay everything else, sky, earth, and the delicate order that kept the world turning. Their marriage began, as so many things in Greek myth did, with deception. Zeus had courted Hera endlessly, but she refused him. Tired of her resistance, he transformed himself into a small cuckoo bird, shivering in the rain outside her window. When she took pity and drew the bird close to warm it, he revealed himself and declared that her compassion had bound them together. Whether that counts as romance depends entirely on one's patience for divine theatrics. Their wedding, though, was magnificent. All the gods attended. The earth blossomed with new flowers, and a feast was held that lasted 9 days. The Horae, goddesses of the seasons, crowned Hera with a garland of gold, and the Graces danced beside her throne. Even the mortals far below were said to feel the air soften, as though heaven itself exhaled in celebration. For a moment, The world was perfect, but perfection is not the natural state of things, not even for gods. Zeus was restless almost immediately. He loved Hera, perhaps, but he loved variety more, and Hera, bound by her own sacred vows, found herself trapped in an eternal contradiction. The goddess of marriage, married to the universe's most unfaithful husband, it would have broken a lesser being. Hera, instead, turned endurance into art. Their argument shook Olympus. Poets often describe the other gods quietly slipping away whenever Zeus and Hera began to quarrel once, after one particularly cutting remark. Zeus hung Hera from the sky itself. Golden chains binding her wrists, anvils tied to her feet. The other gods wept for her, but none dared intervene. When at last he freed her, Hera said nothing. Silence became her armour. From then on, her vengeance was quieter, more patient, more terrifying. And yet, despite everything, they always reconciled. The myths say that when Hera bathed in the waters of Canaphos, near Argos, she was renewed, not just in beauty but in spirit. Each time she emerged, Zeus would come to her, contrite for a moment, and they would be together again. Some scholars believe this ritual reflected the Greek belief in the cyclical nature of relationships: destruction, forgiveness, renewal, a pattern as old as the seasons. The Greeks didn't see their god's marriage as tragic. They saw it as essential. The sky and the earth were not always kind to one another, but without their union, the world would collapse. Zeus's thunder fertilized the ground. Hera's stillness received it. Every storm was a conversation between them. One loud, one quiet, both necessary. When the rain fell softly, the poet said Hera had forgiven him. When the lightning flashed, Zeus was explaining himself again. Their story fascinated philosophers. Plato once remarked that the balance between Zeus and Hera symbolized the harmony of opposites: reason and passion, male and female, authority and restraint. To him, the gods were metaphors for the forces that shaped existence. Hera was the binding principle, the law that kept creation coherent. Without her, Zeus's energy would scatter into chaos. Without him, her order would stagnate into stillness. Together, they were the endless rhythm of creation, tension and resolution, storm and calm, betrayal and reunion. But in mythic poetry, it feels more human. You can almost see them in the quiet hours after another celestial quarrel. Zeus sitting on his golden throne, thunderbolt dim in his hand. Hera beside him, refusing to meet his gaze. The air still hums with the echo of their shouting. Somewhere below, mortals light fires and tell stories about their divine rulers, unaware that even gods sit in silence after love has burned too hot. Hera, for all her wounds, remained his counterpart in every ceremony. When the sacrifices were made to Zeus, her name followed his. When temples were built for him, hers often stood nearby. Even mortals, for all their gossip about the gods' affairs, prayed to them together. It was a kind of divine resignation, the acceptance that love, even divine love, is as much endurance as affection. Some ancient festivals reenacted their marriage each spring. A man and woman chosen from the city would stand as Zeus and Hera, exchange vows, and feast before the people. It was less about celebrating passion than honouring stability. The Greeks knew that constancy is not the absence of conflict, but the persistence through it. In their myth, as in their marriages, thunder was not failure. It was simply weather. Even the poets who mocked Zeus's appetites softened when they wrote about Hera. In Homer's Iliad, when she schemes against her husband, she is clever, not cruel. When she seduces him on Mount Ida, she does it not from vanity, but from a longing to feel equal again. And when Zeus wakes afterward, furious but admiring, we glimpse something rare, mutual respect, even affection. It's a strange love story, fierce, exhausted, and eternal. In later centuries, the Romans reimagined them as Jupiter and Juno, smoother, more stately, less tempestuous. But the Greeks' version is the one that lingers, because it feels honest. Their marriage was messy, unkind, and inescapable, just like the world itself. Zeus and Hera weren't moral examples. They were the mythic machinery that explained why creation endured despite its flaws. And perhaps that's why their union never truly ended. Even when Zeus wandered, even when Hera plotted, they remained bound. Their conflicts shaped the weather, the seasons, and the rhythm of mortal life. Each storm was their argument, each dawn their reconciliation. If you could drift up to Olympus at night, when the gods are quiet and the stars burn steady, you might find them there still. Zeus leaning back, watching the horizon. Hera beside him, eyes half closed, neither speaking. Perhaps they've reached a kind of peace by now. The peace that comes when two eternal forces realize they've grown tired of fighting, or perhaps, even now, they're only resting between storms. Either way, their silence is what holds the heavens together. The Greeks understood that they knew that even divine discord could be sacred, that the tension between love and resentment was not a flaw in the world, but its foundation, Zeus and Hera, were not a warning. They were a truth, that creation survives because opposites remain in dialogue, because pride and patience keep each other alive, because even gods cannot exist alone. So, as the night deepens and the thunder grows distant, imagine them there, the eternal couple, king and queen of a restless sky. He with his restless eyes and quiet regret, she with her heavy crown and unreadable calm together. They are the sound of the storm fading into rain. Together, they are the uneasy peace that follows. Together, they are Olympus itself, bright, impossible, and everlasting. Once upon a time, though, as with all Greek myths, once is more a suggestion than a precise timestamp, there lived a man named Orpheus. Now, Orpheus was not a warrior, nor a king, nor even a demigod, which made him something of a novelty in Greek storytelling. Instead, he was a musician, but not just any musician. Orpheus was said to play the lyre so beautifully that even stones wept, and rivers slowed their flow to listen. Birds paused mid-flight, and wild beasts lay down like house cats at his feet. Quite the concert, really. His mother was Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, and his father was either the Thracian king Oeagrus, or, as some rather proud sources claim, Apollo himself. Whether it was royalty or divinity that accounted for his talent, it didn't much matter. The important bit is that Orpheus was a master of his craft, a one-man orchestra with a flair for the melancholic. Orpheus lived in Thrace, a region known in ancient times for its fierce warriors, thick forests, and a general air of mystical spookiness. It was not a place one wandered without a torch and a healthy respect for nature spirits. But for Orpheus, the land sang back to him. He composed melodies that made oak trees lean in closer, and even Hecate, goddess of ghosts and witchcraft, is said to have paused to listen. Now that's an endorsement. As it often happens in myths, Orpheus fell in love. Her name was Eurydice. She's sometimes described as a dryad, a woodland nymph, though in other versions she's mortal, though quite a luminous one. She and Orpheus married, and by all accounts they were happy, blissful even, which, in mythological terms, is rather like announcing a storm during a picnic. Something dreadful was bound to happen. Their happiness was short-lived. Barely had the wedding garlands wilted when fate intervened. Eurydice, walking alone through a sunlit meadow, never a good idea in a Greek myth, was spotted by a shepherd named Aristaeus. Now, Aristaeus was the rugged, rustic sort, a son of Apollo and a minor god of beekeeping, among other agricultural talents. He saw Eurydice and was overcome with lust. Whether it was divine mischief or just very poor judgment, he chased her. Fleeing through the underbrush, Eurydice stepped on a serpent. One bite, one moment of excruciating pain, and she collapsed. The poison spread fast. By the time Orpheus reached her, she was gone. Just like that. Orpheus was shattered. His grief wasn't the loud kind. It was silent and heavy, like snowfall over a grave. He wandered the hills, playing his sorrow into the world. The birds didn't sing anymore, they listened. Even the rocks, notoriously hard-hearted, seemed to mourn. But sorrow, for all its weight, eventually stirs resolve. Orpheus made a decision no living man had made before. He would journey into the underworld and bring her back. Now, the underworld wasn't designed for round-trip travel. It was ruled by Hades, a god who believed firmly in no refunds. The land of the dead was shrouded in shadow, guarded by Cerberus, the three-headed dog, and accessible only by ferry, operated of course by Charon, who took only obols placed in the mouths of the deceased. Fortunately, Orpheus had not only charm, but also a certain confidence in his lyre. He arrived at the river Styx and played for Charon, whose grumpy demeanour melted like butter on a forge. For the first time in perhaps centuries, Charon ferried a living soul across. Next came Cerberus, a monstrous creature with 3 heads and a tail like a venomous whip. Cerberus was not a being easily reasoned with, but Orpheus didn't try reason. He played a lullaby so haunting and gentle that all 3 heads fell into slumber, dreaming perhaps of sticks and belly rubs. Finally, Orpheus reached the throne of Hades and Persephone. Hades was a ruler more feared than loved, a god of absolute finality. Persephone, the queen of the dead, was no less formidable, though her story, abducted from springtime fields, wedded to a death god, yet allowed to return to the surface for part of the year, makes her one of the more layered deities. Orpheus bowed, lifted his lyre, and began to play. No words were spoken, just music. Music that carried every ounce of his grief, every note soaked in love and mourning. He sang of Eurydice's laughter, of the wedding they barely had, of the days they should have spent growing old together. He sang of lost summers and ghosted futures. And the impossible happened. The Furies wept, Persephone covered her face, and Hades, cold-blooded custodian of the dead, was moved. He granted Orpheus his wish, with a condition. Eurydice would follow him back, but he must not look back at her until both had reached the surface. No glances, no whispers, no confirmation of her presence, just trust. Now one might think this a simple enough instruction, but myths thrive on the delicate tensions of the human psyche. Orpheus had just descended into hell itself. He'd walked past ghouls and tormented shades, played his soul out to divine rulers, and now, with Eurydice behind him in utter silence, he was expected to climb upwards, blind with hope. Step by step, he ascended. The darkness thinned. A breeze began to stir. He could almost hear her, the faint echo of her sandals against the stone. But still, no confirmation, no words. And just as he reached the threshold, just as daylight broke across his face, he turned. Some say it was instinct. Others say he doubted. Or perhaps it was love itself, too overwhelming to resist. Regardless, his eyes met hers for one brief, frozen instant, and she began to vanish. Her form blurred like fog, drifting back into shadow. Her hand reached forward, lips parted, but no sound came. Then she was gone. Again? Only this time, forever. Orpheus tried to descend once more, but the passage was closed. The gods had made their mercy clear. There would be no repeat performance. So he returned to the world above. Alone. Again. And here, perhaps, the myth becomes most human. Orpheus did not move on. He did not remarry. He shunned all lovers and wandered the earth, playing his sorrow into the winds. Trees bent to listen, animals followed, and even the gods seemed to leave him alone, out of pity, or perhaps reverence. Now you might wonder, what exactly was the point of such a cruel test? Why allow him so close, only to snatch her away? In part, it reflects an ancient theme, the fragility of human hope. Greek tragedy isn't about happy endings, it's about the beauty of striving, even in the face of certain doom. Orpheus becomes a symbol of love's reach and the peril of doubt. Historically, Orpheus became a central figure in what would be called the Orphic Mysteries, a spiritual movement that believed the soul could ascend beyond its mortal coil through purity, music, and understanding. His journey to and from the underworld was seen not just as a tale of love, but as a metaphor for enlightenment and transcendence. Poets and artists adored him. Virgil, in his Georgics, gave Orpheus a beautifully tragic ending. Ovid, in Metamorphoses, added emotional resonance. Later, medieval and Renaissance thinkers reimagined him as a Christ-like figure, a martyr for beauty and love. But the ancient Greeks? They were both more honest and more ruthless. They believed in fate, and in their telling, Orpheus' end came not from age or grief, but from the Maenads, the wild, frenzied followers of Dionysus. Offended by his rejection of women, or perhaps incited by some frenzied ritual, they tore him apart, limb from limb. His head and lyre, still singing, floated down the river Hebrus, carried to the sea. His final song, they say, was one of peace. The Muses, his divine kin, retrieved what they could and buried his remains at the foot of Mount Olympus. There, the nightingales sing more sweetly than anywhere else. There's a certain poetry in that ending. Orpheus, the man who loved too deeply, now rests in eternal harmony. His lyre became a constellation, Lyra, placed in the sky by the gods, as if even they could not bear to let him fade entirely. So what does this all mean for us? Perhaps Orpheus teaches us that love, even doomed love, holds a kind of sacred power. That beauty lies not just in happy endings, but in the striving. And that doubt, while painfully human, is the shadow cast by our brightest hopes. And now, as you lie here, drifting into the soft haze of sleep, let the gentle hum of Orpheus's lyre follow you. He played not to win, but because he must. Because love, however cursed, demanded it. And in that quiet place between dreaming and waking, perhaps Eurydice hears it still. Ah, ancient Athens, a city of philosophers, of democracy, and, quite helpfully for our story, of operatic family dysfunction. Our tale this evening unfolds in the shadow of kings and gods, among bloodlines so tangled you'd be forgiven for needing a corkboard and red string. At its heart lies a woman named Phaedra, a man named Hippolytus, and the kind of cursed romance that makes one grateful for rather ordinary heartbreaks. Let us begin, as all good tragedies do, with Theseus. Yes, that Theseus, the slayer of the Minotaur, the proud prince who navigated the labyrinth, string in hand, and then, somewhat less impressively, abandoned his lover Ariadne on a random island like last week's olives. Charming fellow. Years later, Theseus married Ariadne's sister, Phaedra, because why suffer a clean break when one can embroil an entire bloodline? Phaedra was the daughter of Minos, king of Crete, and Pasiphae, daughter of the sun god Helios. Her sister Ariadne had helped Theseus slay her own monstrous half-brother. So you might say Phaedra's family gatherings were complicated. Now when she married Theseus, Phaedra became stepmother to his son Hippolytus, born of an earlier union with the Amazon queen, Hippolyta. The Amazons, you'll recall, were a fierce band of warrior women who didn't especially care for traditional domestic arrangements, or indeed men. So Hippolytus was raised more in their vein, aloof, chaste, and frankly more interested in hunting than in humans. He worshipped Artemis, goddess of the hunt and protector of virgins, and actively avoided Aphrodite, goddess of love and lust. This, as it turns out, was an ill-advised theological stance. You see, in Greek myth, the gods don't much care for being snubbed, especially not Aphrodite. She didn't just encourage passion, she demanded it. And when Hippolytus dismissed her realm in favour of Artemis and his virtuous, abstinent pursuits, Aphrodite was, shall we say, not amused. So, in a fashion that only the gods could consider just, she decided to teach him a lesson, not by striking him directly, but by orchestrating a most exquisite disaster. Her target, Phaedra. Aphrodite caused Phaedra, the respectable queen, to fall violently, hopelessly in love with her stepson. Now pause a moment. This is not your garden variety crush. This was a supernatural compulsion, a divine manipulation of the heart. Phaedra fought it, she tried everything. She prayed, she wept. She contemplated death as a preferable option. But the passion remained, feverish, shameful, and utterly destructive. Eventually, Phaedra confided in her nurse, an elderly servant with all the discretion of a town crier on market day. The nurse, thinking she was helping, approached Hippolytus and revealed the queen's feelings. Now Hippolytus, remember, was not exactly a people person. His reaction was one of horror, disgust, and high moral indignation. He rejected the idea outright, insulted Phaedra, and, depending on the version, threatened to tell his father, Theseus. And so Phaedra, humiliated and terrified, took the only path she saw open. She wrote a letter accusing Hippolytus of attempting to seduce her, and then took her own life. When Theseus found her lifeless body and read the note, he was consumed with grief and fury. Not known for his even temper or investigative rigour, he cursed his son without so much as a conversation. Here's where things take a divine turn. Theseus happened to be on friendly terms with Poseidon, god of the sea, who had granted him 3 wishes, like a cosmic gift card. With one of these wishes, Theseus asked for Hippolytus' death. Poseidon obliged. As Hippolytus drove his chariot along the shore, a monstrous bull, a gift from the sea god, rose from the waves, panicked the horses, and sent the chariot careening. Hippolytus was thrown, dragged, and fatally wounded. Only later, much too late of course, did Theseus learn the truth. Artemis herself descended, explaining the cruel game Aphrodite had played, the lie that cost a life and the loyalty his son had shown to virtue and restraint. There is, needless to say, no scene more thoroughly Greek than a god turning up after everything's already gone to Hades. Theseus was devastated, and Hippolytus. He died in agony, having lost the love of his father, the clarity of his life's purpose, and, ironically, his life, despite never having loved at all. Now let us take a breath and peek behind the myth. The tale of Phaedra and Hippolytus has been retold across centuries. Euripides, that dark-hearted dramatist of the 5th century BCE, gave us one of the earliest full versions in his tragedy Hippolytus. In it, he explores themes of divine injustice, the dangers of repression, and the ruinous consequences of desire, particularly desire denied. In Euripides' hands, no one is wholly innocent. Phaedra is sympathetic yet weak. Hippolytus is virtuous but cold, even arrogant. Theseus is rash, a father governed by passion rather than reason. And the gods? Oh, they are little more than vindictive forces, meddling in the hearts of mortals for sport. Roman writers took up the story as well. Seneca, in particular, leaned into the moral horror of it all, giving us a Phaedra even more tormented, and a Hippolytus even more aloof. The myth was, for the Romans, a warning about ungoverned emotion and the brittle fragility of honour. But beyond the drama lies a question. Why was Hippolytus so thoroughly punished? It seems that in the Greek worldview, extremes, even extreme virtue, were dangerous. Hippolytus rejected love, women, and even the natural order. He refused Aphrodite entirely, and in doing so brought divine wrath upon himself. Moderation, or sophrosyn, was the ideal. Passion, whether indulged or denied, could be ruinous if not tempered with balance. Phaedra, meanwhile, becomes the archetype of the woman torn by uncontrollable longing. In some versions she is a tragic victim, in others a more active deceiver. But even in her darkest portrayals, she is not without pathos. She didn't choose her desire. It was placed in her by Aphrodite, an invasion of the soul. Her suicide, while terrible, is framed as an escape from shame and a desperate, if futile, attempt to protect her honour. It's worth noting too that Hippolytus' death is one of the few in Greek myth that involves the invocation of a wish granted by a god. Theseus' call to Poseidon brings into sharp focus the terrifying idea that divine gifts can just as easily become curses. Be careful what you wish for, they say, and Theseus learned that the hard way. There is also in the background the quiet rivalry between Artemis and Aphrodite, chastity versus desire, each goddess claiming their mortal, each refusing to concede. And Hippolytus? A pawn in their celestial quarrel. Artemis honours him after death, promising that young girls will sing of him before their weddings, a melancholic tribute to a man who never loved. In later centuries, the myth would influence everything from Racine's Phaedra, a French tragedy of seething guilt and eloquent repression, to modern psychological interpretations of obsession, denial, and the tragic inevitability of miscommunication. It's a story not just about forbidden love, but about the impossibility of perfection. So what are we to make of this tale? Perhaps it whispers to us in the quiet hours that love, when twisted by pride or denial, becomes unrecognizable. That purity without empathy can be as dangerous as passion without restraint. That gods, whether ancient or of our own making, are rarely fair. As you drift now gently towards sleep, consider the image of Hippolytus driving his chariot along a glittering shore, unaware of the doom rising from the sea. Consider Phaedra, torn between longing and honour, a queen undone by feelings not her own. And Theseus, flawed, impulsive, human, wishing too late for the truth. In the end, no hero, god, or queen was spared. A love that never bloomed still managed to destroy them all. And so, with the hush of sea waves and the faint whisper of hoofbeats, let the tale fade softly from your mind. After all, in the realm of Greek myth, even silence carries the echo of tragedy. Let us dim the torchlight, settle deeper into our pillows, and drift to a time long before reason and restraint were fashionable. Back when the gods meddled freely in mortal affairs, and beauty could, quite literally, cause the fall of empires. Tonight's tale belongs to a love so cursed, so extravagantly disastrous, that even poets centuries later shook their heads in disbelief. Paris and Helen. She, the most beautiful woman in the world. He, a Trojan prince with the decision-making skills of a sleep-deprived squirrel. Together, they triggered a war that lasted 10 years, toppled a mighty city, and gave us one of the longest and bloodiest epics in Western literature. Romance, anyone? Let us begin, appropriately, with a wedding. But not of Paris or Helen. No, this was the wedding of Peleus, a mortal, and Thetis, a sea nymph. A curious pairing, certainly, but the gods were all invited, except, crucially, for Eris, goddess of discord. As you might imagine, Eris did not take kindly to being snubbed. So, in a move of divine pettiness that would make any soap opera villain blush, she crashed the party and tossed a golden apple into the crowd. Upon the apple were inscribed the words, "To the fairest." Now, if you know anything about Greek goddesses, you know this sort of thing is best avoided. Immediately, 3 stepped forward to claim the prize. Hera, queen of the gods, Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Not a trio known for sharing. Zeus, wisely refusing to choose between his wife and 2 of his most powerful daughters, appointed a mortal judge, Paris of Troy, a prince known more for his looks than his wit. Poor lad. He was tending his flocks on Mount Ida when the 3 goddesses appeared, shimmering and radiant, each offering a bribe more tempting than the last. Hera promised him power, rule over vast lands and mighty kingdoms. Athena offered wisdom and victory in battle, eternal glory on the field. And Aphrodite, she offered him love. Specifically, the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, ever the romantic, or perhaps simply a man with an eye for aesthetics, chose Aphrodite. Thus, with the flick of a divine promise, the stage was set. Now, the most beautiful woman in the world was Helen of Sparta, daughter of Zeus and Leda. Yes, the same Leda whom Zeus seduced in the form of a swan, in what might be mythology's strangest courtship. Helen was raised by King Tyndareus of Sparta and eventually married Menelaus, the king himself. He was a capable ruler, brother to the more famously brutish Agamemnon, and not altogether thrilled when Paris turned up at his palace. Paris, fulfilling Aphrodite's gift, wooed, or, depending on the version, abducted Helen and whisked her away to Troy. Some say she went willingly, bewitched by Aphrodite's charm. Others suggest she had little choice in the matter. Still others believe a phantom Helen went to Troy, while the real one remained in Egypt. But let's not complicate things with metaphysics. What is certain is this: Helen's departure was seen as a grave insult, a personal betrayal to Menelaus, and a political one to every Greek prince who had once vied for her hand. You see, Tyndareus had cleverly made all of Helen's suitors swear an oath, known later as the Oath of Tyndareus, to protect and defend whoever she chose to marry. This turned out to be less a romantic safeguard and more a war clause. And so, the kings of Greece united, not merely to restore one man's pride, but to honour an oath, settle scores, and, if we're being honest, to indulge in a bit of conquering. The result was the Trojan War. The Trojan War. A conflict so grand and so devastating, it took not one, but two epic poems to contain it. The Iliad and the Odyssey. And that's just the beginning. 10 years of siege, countless deaths, and heroes like Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, and Ajax thrown into a whirlwind of battle, all for the sake of one woman's love. Or lust. Or really bad timing. Now, what of Paris and Helen during this war? Paris, though not devoid of courage, was no match for the great Greek heroes. He was better with words than weapons, and preferred archery to hand-to-hand combat, a rather unmanly thing in Homeric eyes. It was he who shot Achilles in the heel, though with some divine assistance, of course. Even his most famous kill comes shrouded in debate. Helen, meanwhile, remained in Troy, often portrayed as guilt-ridden and conflicted. Homer gives us glimpses of her regret, her sense of alienation. In the Iliad, she calls herself a shameless whore, blaming herself for the bloodshed. Yet we also see her cleverness, her nobility, and her strange affection for her new Trojan family, even as the Greeks pound at the gates. The war eventually ends, as you may recall, with the ruse of the Trojan horse, a grand deception led by Odysseus, who tricked the Trojans into wheeling their doom inside the city walls. That night, Greek soldiers emerged from the hollow belly of the horse and opened the gates. Troy burned. The city was razed, men slaughtered, women enslaved, children thrown from walls. It was not a rescue. It was a reckoning. And Paris, he died before the fall, wounded by the Greek hero Philoctetes, his pleas for healing ignored. Helen, remarkably, survived. Here history takes a twist. Helen was taken back to Sparta by Menelaus. Not executed, not shunned, but restored as queen. In Euripides' play Helen, she's even